date is December 17th, 2024. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Figure Four Podcast. My name is Doug. This episode, Donald and I go back and we're going to try to digest a little bit of an old series that was around a few years back, the Monday Night Wars. Every few shows, we're going to try to cover 3 or 4 episodes, and we hope you guys enjoy. Check it out. So when we do this, because there's like 20 episodes of the Monday Night Wars, and I'm just going to cover 3 or 4. We're going to cover 3 or 4 episodes at a time, instead of like just. I don't want to do 20-part show on the Monday Night Wars, so we're just going to kind of go through it. We'll throw our 2 cents in, and we'll talk about it like that. So it'll probably wind up being a 5 or 6 part series on the Monday Night Wars, because there is a lot to unpack. So
there's a lot. There's an awful lot.
The first one, the first episode, and it was a wicked documentary, if you want to call it a documentary series. The war begins, and they basically touch about the 80s and how it was huge because it was huge because of Hulk Hogan whenever he came in for the second time from the AWA, and he started working for Vince Jr. And we talked about this before in other episodes. I think it was the Mr. McMahon thing, the Netflix documentary that was on that. McMahon wanted to get out of the regional wrestling and take over the world. So WWE, WWF at the time, they were on the USA Network. And then they got in bed with Ted Turner on TBS Superstation. Which I think, I could be wrong, I think it was Georgia Championship Wrestling. So I believe Vince bought that territory or that TV slot. He gave Turner basically money, but Turner was getting pissed off because Vince was kind of burning the candle at both ends of the stick. He was on TBS, but he was also still on the USA Network. But yep. Vince had bought that TV spot. So after a while, Turner didn't want to stay working with Vince anymore. Like I said, I think it was because he was on the USA Network at the same time as him. So he basically bought back the spot that Vince had for $1 million. Vince took that $1 million, and that's what he funded WrestleMania 1 with. So that was kind of the beginning of the Monday Night Wars right there. They were kind of in bed together, and then they had a falling out, and then that was it. He went on his way. But I mean, when you've got, back then it was still regional. And you kind of had two, well, you can't really call Ted Turner a promoter, but you basically had 2 different territories working together, which never really happened before. I mean, every now and then you would bring someone in from another territory, like a big name or whatever. But they were just, I mean, it's basically New York against the South's wrestling, which was kind of different. I mean, we were kids. I don't remember WWE being on TBS Superstation. I was too young. I don't even know if we were hardcore into wrestling. I don't think for me, myself anyway, I didn't start getting into wrestling until just before WrestleMania 2 for me. I mean, we watched a little bit with Nana. That sounds about right. We watched a little bit with Nana, just the local wrestling, like on television, Atlanta Grand Prix Wrestling, but WWF, I don't remember. So, after WrestleMania 1, the WWF starts getting bigger. Jim Crockett Promotions, they couldn't compete. So in 1988, Turner bought it out and became WCW. They changed the name because of like legal reasons and all that stuff. Now, when Turner bought it, WCW, well, Jim Crockett Promotions, they were losing money hand over fist. Turner always loved wrestling. He wanted wrestling on his programming, and now he was happy that he actually owned a wrestling federation. It took a few years for WCW to compete. And then by the early 90s, even WWF started to suck. So it's not like WCW was always bad. It's almost as though, like, come the 90s, I mean, Hogan looking for crowd approval. It was the same thing over and over and over and over again. WWF started losing its mojo too. So wrestling had to change, it had to evolve. And so Vince McMahon went out and created Monday Night Raw. And in that little dungeon, January 11, 1993, from the Manhattan Center, live, which was a first. Wrestling really hadn't been a live television show in a primetime spot before. It was different. It looked different. I still remember the cards that the ring girls would bring around. I like it raw and all that crit.
Yep.
Now, you watched it. I think we both watched it at the same time when they started this new show. When Raw came out, I mean, it looked a lot. To me, I was like, it kind of looked bad because we were so used to seeing, like, watching wrestling on Saturday mornings or even Saturday afternoons on Wrestling Challenge, where, I mean, they were in arenas, sold out big arenas. And now they're in the Manhattan Center that held like 3,000 people, if it held 3,000 people. I don't even think it held that. I don't remember. I'd have to go back and look, but it definitely wasn't an arena. What did you think of it? Do you remember what you thought when it first came out?
Okay, so when Raw first kicked off, it kind of reminded me of, what's the name of the arena, the ECW arena, Studio 2300?
Yes, yeah.
It reminded me of that atmosphere, and I'm like, okay, so they're looking at going with like a smaller, like a more intimate atmosphere, like keeping things close, like keeping the crowd on top of things. But then I'm like Saturdays, you've got like these full arenas that you're playing. At the time, they were recorded shows, and now you're going live to such a small. It struck me as weird. I'll be honest with you, because sure, okay, WWE, they're looking at changing things up. They're looking at evolving the roster. They're looking at just changing the program. And I'm like, in this industry, like you go big or you go home. And why would you go to a smaller crowd? And the first thing that comes to my mind when they were broadcasting from that small, it was kind of like an amphitheater,
yeah,
if you want to call it that. Like, I mean, it's a smaller venue. Is Jerry Lawler talking to Stu and Helen Hart up in the crowd, and they were like up in the gondola, and he was just like running Brett into the ground in the ring and like talking smack about Helen. Like that, when I think about that venue, that's the first thing that comes to my mind is Jerry Lawler just trolling the Hart family.
He always did. Jesus Christ, some of the things that he'd say, it was just, and Bobby Heenan was bad too. I still,
the brain was bad.
Oh, I still remembered. I could see Stu and Helen sitting eye to eye over a bowl of prunes, and they'll call it senile in Seattle. Like everyone, Bobby Heenan and Jerry Lawler ripped on the Hart family so much, but it was funny shit. It was good. So they're in a smaller venue, but they're live. And they're, your gate, I guess your gate's not going to be the greatest, but I'm sure they're still selling a little bit of merch in there. But I think I maybe they were going to be making more money off of advertising. Who knows? I don't know. But anyway,
I remember there being IcoPro signs everywhere.
Oh God, chalk. Weightlifters chalk is what a lot of people called that shit. So with the new show, Vince didn't really need the older guys anymore. He was going with a younger movement. Like Brett was still a baby. Shawn was still a baby. You had the 1, 2, 3 kid. Undertaker was still young. He was moving away or trying to get away from the older guys. So he didn't need Hogan. Savage was sitting there doing commentary, which was well documented that Savage thought he could still wrestle and he could still go. He didn't like sitting behind the desk. It was nice for a change, but after a while, Savage wanted to actually wrestle. So
Was
Hogan,
Piper still on the broadcast at that point?
I
Or was
don't,
Piper moved on?
I think Piper had moved on at that point.
Okay.
I think it was Savage, Jerry Lawler, and Vince McMahon was doing the
Right.
play-by-play. I could be wrong, but from what I remember, I think Piper was already he wasn't in that role anymore. Uh, Vince took Vince took Luger after Hogan left. They tried to push Luger to be the next Hulk Hogan, and it just wasn't going to work. He didn't have the charisma of Hulk Hogan.
The Lex Express.
Jesus, what a waste of fuel.
Well,
and
they started off.
money and
They started off with what the narcissist,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then they moved on to the Lex Express, and I mean we all know how that ended up panning out, which it didn't.
yeah. He was never going to be the next Hulk Hogan. So Luger didn't. He just didn't have the charisma that Hogan had. But Raw was getting bigger with him. He was still a big part. Vince said it was hard to go live every week, and makes sense. He said he didn't have access to a whole lot of money back in 1994, 1993, whenever Raw came. Because business was doing, it wasn't that bad. It was time to transition and try to make it big again. So they went live every couple of weeks instead of every week because it was just too expensive, from what McMahon said. Now, on the other side of the coin, while this is going on and they're going live and then they're recording a little bit and they're going live, bring in the devil. Eric Bischoff is hired by World Championship Wrestling in 1991, comes in calls himself a level C announcer. So you got Jim Ross and whoever, then you got whoever, and then you got lowly Eric Bischoff. Eventually, WCW is looking for an executive producer. Eric threw his hat in the ring. He got the job. And the first thing he did was take WCW out of the small, dingy places that they were recording their TV. He wanted them to he wanted them to look like Monday Night Raw. Like the Manhattan Center was small, but the way WWE had it done up, it actually looked pretty good and pretty classy and a cool place to be. So Bischoff, when he gets the job as executive producer, takes WCW out of those dingy little places, arenas that they were recording, or high schools, wherever it was, takes them to the Disney MGM studio, stage 2, and got rid of all the Southern announcers because he didn't want to make it sound like a Southern-based wrestling company. Kept Tony Schiavone. I've always loved Schiavone. I always thought he was a wicked announcer. And brought in guys like Gene Okerlund and Bobby Heenan. Do you remember when Gene Okerlund was on, I think it was the Clash of the Champions, and he introduced Bobby Heenan, and it almost looked like he was ready to start crying. And Heenan came out and he said, "Heenan, why are you following me? You followed me everywhere I go. What are you doing here?" Them two were just fucking awesome. I loved Bobby Heenan. I loved him. And Gene got almost like an attitude when he went to WCW, which you didn't see in the WWF. He was always very professional and, like just did the mic things. But Gene got like an attitude, telling people to stick it in their ass or whatever in WCW. But Bobby just stayed being Bobby.
Oh, the brain was the brain. There was you can't change that character. But I got to agree. Like when Gene showed up in WCW, it was like he grew a set.
Yeah, he was just getting old and cranky.
Yeah, get off my lawn kind of thing. And I think part of that was maybe it was creative from WWE, WWF at the time. Like maybe he had to follow the shtick that McMahon was laying down. Like you're going to be this, you're going to talk about this. And we've sent each other like some behind the scenes interviews, like where Gene would crack, like when he would break, like during like a macho interview or something like that. But like it kind of felt like when he went to WCW, he was allowed to just kind of be himself.
Yeah, that's the way it seemed. And you know what? I never ever heard any reason why he left the WWF. I didn't hear he was released, but I also never looked into it. I never heard he released. He was released. I never heard that they just didn't want to pick up his contract after it expired. Maybe Gene was the one that didn't want to renew and wanted to go back to World Championship Wrestling. I don't know. I never heard anything, but I also didn't research it either.
Neither.
But as
Neither
far
have
as
I.
I know, whenever he did leave and go to World Championship Wrestling, one thing I know for sure, it was not on bad terms. There was
No,
nothing they both, however it happened, McMahon never had a bad thing to say about Okerlund, and Okerlund never had a bad thing to say about McMahon,
never,
as far as I know.
never. I've never seen anything, and I mean, look at the time too. I mean, like you've got guys like Hogan and Mach and Perfect. Like those guys they're leaving Connecticut. They're going down to Atlanta. And maybe it was just maybe Mean Gene was part of that too. Like maybe they were looking at moving on from what used to be the big thing
Quite
in
possibly.
WWE. It could be. I mean, we can speculate all we want, but I mean, just like you said, I never heard anything as to what led to that departure. I don't know.
So at that time, when Bischoff got stage 2 at Disney MGM Studios in Orlando, Hogan was right next door filming Blunder in Paradise. Um, Bischoff, Ric Flair kept going down, trying to put a bug in his ear because Bischoff knew that he couldn't just flounder with the talent that he had. He needed a flagship. Not that Ric Flair wasn't a flagship, but Ric Flair was more, I guess he was like Hogan. It was two 80s.
Yeah.
In the 80s, Hogan ruled the WWF. In the 80s, Ric Flair owned Jim Crockett Promotions and the National Wrestling Alliance. But now in the 90s, they did. Wrestling fans have a very good long-term memory. And everything that was old could now be new again with Hogan with a new postal code, zip code type thing. So they try and 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 they try. And Hogan didn't want to do it, didn't want to do it, didn't want to do it. But then he started getting the itch again. After a few months, June 11th, 1994, Hogan signs his WCW contract. And he brought new life to WCW. It was just like, whoa, like, and you could see it, like you could hear it in the announcers, you could see it in the other wrestlers. It's like everyone had to pick up their game now. This is like a second chance. So when Hogan signed with World Championship Wrestling, McMahon was a little bit upset because he knew WCW and Ted Turner were going to be real competition now, but he was more upset at Hogan because Hogan always swore whenever he asked for his release, started doing Blunder in Paradise, that he would never compete against Vince. And now, June 1994, Hogan signs with World Championship Wrestling. Didn't piss him off, but Vince said it kind of hurt his feelings a little bit. Do you feel bad for Vince?
No. if I'm being honest. At the time, I mean, Vince was looking at moving on from the guys that built WWE to what it was at that point. I mean, you've got everything at that time. You've got the steroid scandal. You've got, everything that was going on behind the scenes. And so Vince is looking at moving on from the Hulksters, the Sid Vicious, Justice, whatever he was at the time. He's looking at moving on from the bigger guys. And they're all of a sudden showing up in WCW, where in WWE, you've got Brett now leading, like he's the flagship. You've got Shawn. At the time, you still had Razor Ramon. You still had Diesel. So you still had
Taker.
that. You had Taker. You had that newer generation that he was looking to move forward with. And guys like Hogan, Mach, Sid, like they all go back down to Atlanta. And and looking at it from Bischoff's standpoint, I mean, these guys are already made. They've got names.
Yep.
So he just has to bring them into the mix and figure out how are we going to make this dance work.
Yeah.
And so when I look at it from the Vince versus Hogan standpoint, I mean, if Hogan's looking to get back into the business, and Vince has already said it at this point, like at that time, he's like, the red and yellow is worn off, like the American hero is worn off, like we're moving on from that, like, go do your thing. And for Hogan to come out and say that, like, I'll never compete against you
Yeah.
as a performer, that's huge for Hogan to say. But then those creative juices come back.
Well, and that's the thing, and it's a brand new playground to play in.
Exactly. And like we didn't have TNA, we didn't have AEW.
Two places to go, if
it
you
was
were a wrestler.
It was WCW or it was WWE.
There wasn't even ECW yet, and the indie scene definitely wasn't what it is now.
No, God, no.
You had two places. And it wasn't like Hogan needed the money. Let's not kid ourselves. But like you said, it was the creative juices. Like, he can stand there and stroke that Fu Manchu and be like, a whole new place to say that doesn't work for me, brother.
Yep. Let's be honest, too. I mean, you're not going to see Hulk Hogan performing at a bingo hall.
No, not a chance.
He's not going to come back into the industry just to put on the boots and wrestle some friggin' jabroni that works at a 7-Eleven.
No.
He's coming back to where the big boys play, which we'll get into.
Yes, we will. So,
but yeah, I don't feel sorry for Vince at all. I mean, he knew what he was losing when he wasn't looking at re-signing Hogan, and Hogan wanted to move on to do his Hollywood stuff.
Well, that being said, too, Vince has even said that at that time, he had felt that the whole Hulk Hogan, like say your prayers, eat your vitamins, carry the American flag, all that stuff, it had run its course. And that's why he was going...
At that time, it did.
That's why he was going younger, trying to come up with new ideas. But then Hogan signs with World Championship Wrestling, and Savage is sitting with Vince McMahon every Monday night. And Savage still wants to wrestle. And Savage could still go. But McMahon wanted him as a color commentator. I'm sorry, Macho Man was cool, but he wasn't a color commentator. He had to be in the ring. So next thing you know, Savage leaves, and he goes to WCW. So now you've got two of the biggest stars from the WWF. Basically, that's your heartbeat of World Championship Wrestling. And Turner was ready to keep spending money and bringing in more guys. It didn't matter. So
blank check, man. He had a blank check for everybody.
And guaranteed contracts will make guys jump ship every time.
Absolutely.
McMahon did not give guaranteed money. He just did not. I give opportunity, but then eventually he had no choice but to give those guaranteed contracts because he would have lost everybody. I mean, geez, look at the guys like Hogan left, Savage left, and then next thing you know, I mean, mid-card guys started leaving, like Hacksaw Jim Duggan left. A few mid-card guys, but it was enough to put writing on the wall for Vince, like, Jesus. And not that he could afford it at the time. He couldn't afford to give guaranteed contracts, but he had to start doing something to take care of his guys because everyone started taking off.
Half of the guys, and we've talked about this before. I mean, look at how big the NWO got. Half of what made up the the black and white roster, they were former WWE guys.
Every one of them. Every one
of
them. Until they started recruiting internally.
Yeah.
So 18 months after Bischoff took over WCW, they finally start making money. They're not losing money anymore. Back on the WWF side, Vince is still pushing the young guys. Like we talked about before, Brett, Shawn, Taker, Hunter. I don't think Rock was there yet. Or even Rocky Maivia. I don't think he was there at this point. Because
he wasn't as big as what he would eventually turn out to be. He was still come out to the ring, smile, You know,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
you end up losing the match, go back to the locker room, and you're still smiling. Like that was the Rocky that we had at the time.
So at one point, it was in August, Turner calls Bischoff into his office. Oh, Eric, what do we gotta do to compete with Vince and the WWF? And Bischoff, from his own mouth, says he wasn't prepared for that question. I don't know how you could not be. But he blurts out, give me prime time. Let's go live, give me prime time. Thinking Turner would never do it in a million years. And he gets it. Scott, give Eric 2 hours every night on TNT, the flagship station of Turner Broadcasting, TNT. Bischoff is in prime time. So he's got 6 weeks to put this show together. That's all he had. So, but he pulled it off. And September 4th, 1995, Monday Nitro was live from the Mall of America. Now, when that first, I couldn't wait to see how it was going to be. And I guess for a mall, they had it set up pretty damn cool. It was definitely different. It felt live. It felt live. And that's a really, really weird comment to make because I don't know how something can feel live, but it was just a different, I don't know, it was a different energy whenever the cameras came on. It was a completely different vibe. It was cool. Like, not that Raw wasn't cool, don't get me wrong. Raw was still the big show on television as far as wrestling goes, but now WCW had their chance to strut their stuff and show what they could do. So the show is going on, and all of a sudden, after being on television 2 nights before or whatever it was, Lex Luger walks down the aisle on the first episode of Monday Nitro with no contract. No one in WWE knew Lex Luger's contract was up. Now, I understand, like things get kind of like lost in the shuffle when you're running a business like that or whatever. But this was a guy, I mean, it didn't work, but you were pushing to be your next version of Hulk Hogan. And he was still a pretty big part of the WWF. But at this point, I think he was teaming with Davey Boy Smith a little bit and stuff like that, like the Allied Powers or whatever the hell they were. So he wasn't up as high as he was, but he was still a big part of it. And he walks out and no one knew. Even 123 Kid said, I had just traveled with him 2 days ago and Lex didn't say a word, but that was one thing Bischoff told him. You tell nobody. Luger said you always want to do the right thing. You don't want to burn a bridge in this company in this business. And it's like that anywhere. You never know when you might have to cross that bridge again.
Yeah.
But Bischoff said, you're not giving notice. Your contract is up. You're just not showing up to the next show. And you don't tell anybody this. And Bischoff wasn't a big Lex supporter. He said, I offered him $100,000 thinking he'd turn it down. But this is Lex's way. And Sting, if it wasn't for Sting, Luger never would have showed up.
Oh, God, no.
So paid him $100,000. He kept his mouth shut, which was still a lot of money in 1995, 1994, whatever the hell. Luger shows up. Everyone is just losing their shit because he was just on WWF television. It still blows my mind that no one in the World Wrestling Federation in the office had any idea that Lex Luger's contract was up and had been for a little while.
Like,
was it coming up to being up?
I mean, well, from what Bischoff has gone on to say, and this is going back on to Who Killed WCW, and they touched on this about Lex coming back. How do you let, like you said, the person that you brought in to be the next Hogan, like the next stalwart, of leading your brand, how do you let that contract run out? And it had run out.
Yeah.
And he shows up, and like for me, when we watched that show, and it was like it almost kind of felt like it was like a coming home for Luger. Like
Yeah,
I
somewhat.
never felt like his personality never really worked with WWE.
No,
Like he
because he
was in
had been painted with he was a Jim Crockett Promotions guy. You know, he
he
had
was
been painted,
NWA.
yeah, you know, like he was Atlanta.
Yeah,
He wasn't New York.
no, not at all. And like to see him walk out on that show at the Mall of America, I was like, holy crap. And like I think that was during like Sting's match. Like and Luger just walks out and
Yeah, it
like
was. It
even
was
like
Sting's.
the look on Sting's face, it was like holy shit, like this is happening. And you know, just like thinking back, like I mean, we're talking like Jesus, how many years ago, man? Like 20 years ago when this happened. And Luger walks out, and I remember him just, he's wearing a white shirt, black pants, and he just puts his hands on his hips and he's just looking around. And you hear Tony losing his mind. You know, I'm like, he's home.
Yeah.
Like this is home for him. But the fact that the WWE dropped the ball on him and, you know, they let his contract run out, I was like, how do you let that happen?
Yeah. There was
Right?
and that's not one person's fault. That's an entire company's fault.
Absolutely.
So Raw was like we talked about before. Now we're going back to the Raw side. Vince had said that it was expensive to go live. So they went live every other week or every 2 weeks or something like that. So now here comes the dirty work on the executive vice president, Eric Bischoff. He starts, do you remember Nitro used to start about 3-4 minutes before Monday Night Raw? They started, now we lived in Eastern Canada at the time. So Raw would start at 9 o'clock on the nose. Nitro would start at like 8:57 or 8:56. And that was Bischoff's time. And he didn't always do it right at the start of the show. Sometimes he did it throughout the night. But here come giving the results because Raw was taped. Any chance he could give away results from Monday Night Raw. If it was taped and canned and re-aired, he loved doing it. And you know what? Here's the thing. Okay, you know WCW is competition now. Okay, you can't afford to go live. I get it. WCW lost a lot of money, and well, not just WCW, but the National Wrestling Alliance lost a lot of money over the years. You're competing now with another company that's right on your heels. If you don't want, is it dirty business? Yes. Was it a dick move that Bischoff was doing, giving the results? Yes. But get your head out of your ass, put your big boy panties on, and go out and do something about it, which is basically, Bischoff basically forced Vince McMahon to go out and do something. If you don't want me to give away your results, do something about it. Dirty? Absolutely. Would I do it if I wanted to win or be better? Probably. I can be a prick too. But we used to laugh about it. Like, oh my God, he just said who's going to win, like, oh, so they're not live. We always thought they were live every night. No, they're not live. So he's, at the same time, he's kind of letting secrets out too. Like, oh, they say Monday Night Raw live. Well, they're not fucking live because they already know who's going to win. So dirty. Yeah, but get over it. Fix it. So by December of 1995, Raw and Nitro are the only wrestling shows on TV, and they're still pretty close. They're still pretty neck and neck, but Vince is feeling the heat. The business is still in not a downward spiral, but it's got to evolve a bit. and he knows it does on both sides. Both sides have to like pull up their socks. Like, but Bischoff giving away results, that's just a little bit of a leg up. But
Yep.
both sides weren't doing fantastic. So that was the end of the first episode. The second episode is the rise of the NWO. So out of all the talent coming up in the WWF, the biggest stars, hands down, at this point that were established, I mean, you still had Brett, you still had Shawn. They were still really big. But the biggest guys, at least the guys that we loved the most anyway, were Diesel and Razor. Brett and
Absolutely.
Taker and those guys, they were still good, but Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were the biggest stars, hands down. That's why they were probably getting paid the most money. But the mid-card characters weren't that great. Who did you have? You had Mantar. You had Doink. You had Crush. You had a garbage man. You had a plumber. You had a hockey player. You had a baseball player. The mid-card was not doing that great. By that time, whenever like these guys were around, Hall and Nash's contracts are coming up. So now I'm going to ask you this. So we all know Scott Hall was the first one to go to WCW, and then Kevin Nash followed a few weeks after. So obviously there was, and we touched a little bit on this in other episodes. Obviously there were no compete clauses in their contracts at the time. That's why they were able to pretty much go right away within a week or something like that.
Right.
I think Scott Hall actually finished in the Garden on a Sunday or a Saturday, and then Monday he was on Nitro. Now, if you're Vince McMahon and your wrestlers, Scott Hall gives you notice. You know where he's going. You have
100%.
to, you know where he's going. You know he's going to make that more money after he's already come to you and say, what can I do to make more money? Scott Hall even said, I even asked Vince McMahon to move the decimal one spot on the merch. He said, I don't know if the McMahon family would notice it. He said, but the Hall family would sure notice it. And Scott Hall and Kevin Nash were making pretty good money at the time, but you had to be away 300 days a year to make that money. They were nonstop. So now one of your top talents come to you and tells you flat out pretty much, I need more money. He's not going to re-sign with you. You know that he's going to go to your competition. Why did McMahon and Scott Hall, whenever he had left, he had signed not a contract with World Championship Wrestling. He signed a letter of intent. I believe in Georgia, that can still be changed. It could be 11:59 p.m. And if that clock doesn't strike midnight, you can cancel that letter of intent to go and work with another employer.
Right.
I don't know what it would have taken. And I believe it came from Scott Hall that when he came through that curtain the last night that he worked for the WWF, that McMahon looked at him and said, damn it, screw this. You still work for me. And Scott Hall at this point was, no, I'm not changing my mind. I don't care how much money you throw at me, because he had about 3 months before that to fix this. Now, if you're McMahon and your talent comes to you and tells you that you want more money, and he's a big part of your company, why wouldn't you? I mean, look what he did for Brett a few years later. I'll give you $10 million over 20 years or whatever the fuck it was. Scott Hall was still young at this point. He was mid-30s, early 30s or something like that. Same with Kevin Nash. I think they were around the same age. If you're Vince McMahon, why don't you do everything you can to keep this guy when he tells you, I'm signing a letter of intent to work World Championship Wrestling. I'm giving you 3 months notice, knowing you can change this.
Scott Hall leaving is on Vince's shoulders. Straight up. Like that's I mean, he was a great talent at the time. He drew Like, I mean, he was a great drawer
Oh my God, he was he was
at the
awesome
gate,
on the mic. He was a damn
great on the
good
mic.
wrestler. He could
Yep.
sell, he could deliver, and he's like I said, he's making good money. But he can make, but you're working 300 days a year, and he can make the same, if well, probably more money in WCW working 150 days a year. Why the
Well, and
fuck wouldn't you do that?
Kevin Nash said the same thing on his podcast. I'm pretty sure. Like when him and Scott left WWE to go to WCW, it's like, okay, so Scott leaves first. He's like, hey, can you get me something similar to that for a deal? And Scott's like, well, yeah. And you're working half the days in a calendar year. You're making more money. You're staying at home. Your family life is better. I mean, that to me, if I were a talent, that's a no brainer.
I, I,
Absolutely.
I literally work half the year. I work a week, I'm off a week. I work a week, I'm off a week. And I'm making damn good money doing that. These guys, it's kind of the same thing. There's 365 days in a year. Divide that by two. I believe Scott Hall's contract was for 150 or 160 days or something like
And
that.
Kev had something similar to that.
Very similar.
And
Yes.
one thing, and I'm going to kind of maybe sidetrack a little bit here of what we're talking about. That's one thing that I will applaud Triple H with, because they're recording a lot more shows like going into the end of the year, because he wants to have the talent to have time off with their families going into the holidays.
That's right. I saw something about that on the on online today or yesterday that there's been a few taped episodes so
Yeah.
far. You'd never see McMahon do that.
Oh God, no. So I mean, as a fan, like sure, I'm not attending those shows. Like we went to one show back in July in Ottawa, which was live. But I mean, from a fan perspective, I respect it and I can understand it, because Triple H, he was a talent in the ring.
That's right.
He's still somewhat of a talent in the backside of things, but like where he's the boss, he's looking at things from when they were on the road, like you said, 300 days out of the year. He sees the talent. They're getting burnt out on the road. So he's wanting to give back to the talent. And I just want to give a little bit of a little bit of a stick tap to Triple H for allowing him to like to give the talent time off with family. And that's a huge thing. And looking at like Hall and Nash, like at the time, like you said, I mean, you're working the road like 300 days out of the year, man. If you only have to cash in like half of a year, but yet you're pulling down more coin, Jesus, any goddamn wonder.
Any human
Is it
being
any
on the
wonder
face
that
of
they
the
would?
planet would do that.
Absolutely.
Anyone.
I looking at Hall and Nash when they were the first ones to leave WWE, aside from Hogan, aside from Savage, whatever. Looking at Hall and Nash to be like the original outsiders to go to or WCW, to leave WWE, I don't blame them one bit.
Not at all. So he gets there. The way they set him up was huge. The way he showed up. They didn't have him come down the ramp. They had him come through the crowd, hopped over the rail. They did well, there was no internet really back then.
No.
There were some dirt sheets, but they did a pretty good job of keeping Scott Hall showing up a secret. We were surprised
Yeah.
anyway. It was cool the way they brought him in.
Yeah.
Kept on talking like we're taking over, you're against us, all that shit. Now the way, and it did come off that it was because he kept saying, "You know who I am." It was done very well, like it was going to be a takeover.
It was gold, man. It was fucking gold.
So he shows up for a couple of weeks, then Kev shows up. and the ratings are just going. So now, so ratings are going up now. The Outsiders are running all over the place. Uh, they did make it seem like a takeover, but eventually, because of legal bullshit, they had to come right out and have Hall and Nash say they don't work for the WWF. Okay, so we officially know it's not a takeover. They're not planted from the WWF to kill WCW. So we know that, but they still want to go in. They're still trying to like overtake the business type thing. They still have to kind of follow that. So WCW, Hall and Nash come out, like some of the stuff they did. They would come out with baseball bats and, oh my God, here come the Outsiders. And they'd have cops jump in the ring with the wrestlers and have their hands on their guns. Like, for us back then, that was pretty hard hitting stuff. You know,
yeah,
like it was really, really like believable. Like they were on fire, like, and they're not walking around throwing toothpicks and going, ha, ha, and having a big engine sound in your music. So I don't even know where I was going with this.
the the big thing, and I want to throw this out there. The first time that Scott Hall showed up on Nitro, you all know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here.
Yeah. And you know what? The
That
fans loved him from day one, too.
that stuck with me, man. I was just like, what the fuck?
Yeah. And he just come off television, WWF
Yeah.
television, which was cool. And that was the cool thing. I mean, we didn't know anything about contracts or anything like that back then, but obviously there was no compete. No compete clause, because usually it's 90 days or something like that.
Yeah.
So Hall and Nash are coming out and they're being all cool. They're the Outsiders. And your flagship, well, the guy that you brought in a year before to be your flagship for WCW, Hulk Hogan, is going out, and every time he steps through that curtain, he's getting booed to shit. The fans don't want him. They don't want the red and yellow anymore. They couldn't care less about your prayers and taking your vitamins and all that shit. So as it goes, you know, they keep talking about like a third guy because they're going to fight Sting and Macho Man and Luger at Bash at the Beach, whatever pay-per-view it was going to be.
Yeah, it was the Bash.
And we all know how it goes down. Hogan turns on WCW. The NWO is created, and we're off to the races. But that night, like you've always seen, like good guys turn bad guys and bad guys turn good guys. That was probably Hogan dropping that leg on Savage and going with Hall and Nash and becoming a bad guy. That was probably the biggest turn in the history, not of WCW or WWF. That was probably the biggest turn in wrestling history, period. I don't think there was ever anybody that made that kind of an impact on turning on someone than when Hogan turned on Savage.
I have to agree. I mean, here you've got like the American hero Hulk Hogan, you know, like you said, to say your prayers, take your vitamins, say, you know, all that kind of stuff. And him to show up and drop that leg on Macho and side with the Outsiders. It was such a turn. And Hogan even said it, like in God, what documentary was that I was watching? He said it was either going to make his career or it was going to completely, like, he was going to go in the toilet.
Well, and that's the thing, because he had become so stale, and the crowd, especially when Hall and Nash came in, the crowd just didn't care about him anymore. So whenever he turned on Savage and he went with Hall and Nash, it wasn't just a resurgence in wrestling like once it got going. It was a huge resurgence in his career because it was a side of Hulk Hogan that nobody had ever seen before. No
Yep.
one thought he could be an evil bastard, a manipulating bastard, and he was. But
And when he first came into the business, he was a bad guy, but nobody remembered that. And
no,
so
exactly.
for him to come and turn heel, like we're seeing like this American hero. It's like, okay, he's gone stale, let's forget about him. But then it's like, how do you turn on us like that?
Yeah.
Like, and Hogan's, like I said, Hogan said it was either going to make his career or end his career, or it was going to be the worst decision that he ever made. And as it turns out, it was probably the best decision that he ever
It
made.
was probably the biggest. Well, it didn't just help him, and he was the flagship. He was the flagship of the NWO. It
Yep.
made wrestling just off the charts. It was like going back in time to the 80s. That's what
Yep.
it did, like that, which I consider the golden era of wrestling, were the 80s. It took that and it bumped it up again. And it was so good for WCW. By September of 1996, for a very long time, WWF consistently, when Hogan and the Outsiders and the NWO got going, they constantly lost ratings week after week after week after week. So they're gone. They're in WCW, Hall and Nash, pronouns, pal. Um, WWF is still going to bring back, I mean, they're grasping at straws at this point because they're losing ratings. They lost two huge pieces of talent, and they're still going to bring back Diesel and Razor Ramon. WCW, in all their infinite wisdom, thought that Hall and Nash's contracts were null and void and they were actually going to go back to the WWF. So they keep propping it up, propping it up, propping it up until finally the day or the week before or whatever it was that they were going to bring back Razor Ramon and Kevin Nash, WCW comes to them with brand new contracts after only being there a year or however long it is for more money. Screaming at them, is this what you want? Is this what you want? Kevin Nash said he looked at the contract and just burst out laughing and said, yep, that's exactly what I want. So they signed the contracts, and the night that that Razor and Diesel came back, they're all in the back watching a monitor, and out come those fakes. And Hall and Nash just kind of look at each other, chuckle, look at the officials at WCW, and walk away. Oh, the infinite wisdom of World Championship Wrestling. But you know what? Even though, I mean, I was even a little confused watching it. Okay, well, how can they bring back Razor and Diesel when Hall and Nash are over there? I got to see what's going to happen. And it drew, and it did. It drew more people. They were still losing in the ratings, but it made more people tune in to see, okay, how the fuck are they going to bring back Razor and Diesel?
Yeah.
It created a buzz. It created a buzz in the wrestling world. But at this point, they were grasping at straws. I'd think that, well, we know Diesel was Kane. Glenn Jacobs played Diesel. I can't remember the name of the guy that played Razor Ramon. I know he was a Canadian boy.
Yep.
But they weren't very good. I mean, they tried. They tried damn hard. They did better than we could ever do trying to pull off those gimmicks. But it was just bad. And then they tried to make it look like, because it was Jim Ross that brought them back, and he was sour at WWF at the time. And, you know, they tried to make it look like it was Jim Ross trying to make the WWF look bad for like wronging him and all this stuff. Meanwhile, the NWO is just making WCW huge. It actually, like, what some of the stuff that they were doing over there was really innovative because it all looked real. Like with police showing up and that night that they threw Rey Mysterio into the trailer like a dart and they just destroyed the whole backstage area to the point where people that lived in the area were actually calling the police and the ambulance because they thought it was real.
Yeah.
I mean, how can WWE compete with that at that time? The production was just so incredibly superior with real life storylines.
Well, I mean, I think Eric really tapped into that lifeline. Like, going number one, the going live instead of taped. That was the first thing. But then the storylines that he was coming up with, like he knocked that out of the park. And I go back to Stone Cold on his Broken Skull sessions when he had Undertaker on, and he's like, I don't understand how they're knocking us out of the ratings where our show is a lot better. And at that time, like, sure, WWE, they had some pretty good storylines, but WCW taking that live feature and like going with that whole NWO.
Well, what was cool too was like with the NWO, they took, because you had to, because they were always running here, running there. They never came down the ramp. They always came through the crowd or however they did it. They took you behind the scenes and showed fans shit that you never saw before. You saw production trucks. You saw the backstage area, and they were just so cool that I think the wrestling fans, I know I was, you did too. You got tired of good guys in wrestling. Like the NWO I'm going to say Hall and Nash. They were just cool. Everyone wanted to be Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Like you can't act being that cool.
I'm going to go back to Halloween Havoc. I'm pretty sure it was Halloween Havoc 97, 98. And you and I made the NWO shirts and we showed up at Vince's place.
Oh, fuck.
And we went out for a beer and we came back down and we were wearing those T-shirts.
And we set it up so whenever we walked in, it was an NWO match. Like the music was playing and I don't remember who was coming to the ring. It could have been Hogan. I don't know. But we walked in doing the strut with the colors on and Vince just sat there and you could see him fucking raging. Oh, fuck.
I was the little man. You were the big man.
He sat there. He did. I think it took him 10 minutes to say something. I thought he was going to kick us out. So all of a sudden now, so you got Hogan, you got Hall, you got Nash. They're running roughshod. And all of a sudden, new members are coming in. They start with Ted DiBiase and then the 1-2-3 Kid. And next thing you know, Jesus Christ, there's 2 limousines show up with like 15 guys in the NWO. And then all of a sudden, which was cool because I never, ever, ever would have saw this coming. Eric Bischoff, the executive vice president of World Championship Wrestling. He could have been he was running the company, but he could have been higher up at this point.
Right.
Joins the New World Order. Now, you can't get, so you're in charge of a multi-million-dollar company, and this outside group comes in, and they've got the boss of the whole fucking company with them. If that's just storyline after storyline, like you've got a good run in there that, like, okay, these guys are going to be untouchable for the next while. But the problem is, and they did, like, I think for most of the time when Nitro started, they started off with the NWO and they would come to the ring. That's how the show would open. And they'd be in the ring for 20 minutes and they'd be yapping and talking and Bischoff would be talking. And at some point, The talent backstage are getting sick of the New World Order because at this point they had 1 million members. They
Yep.
had, I'd say more than half the roster had an NWO shirt at this point. Like the ring was literally full of NWO shirts.
Yep.
So at this point, it's getting watered down. I mean, it's not as bad as it did eventually get, but it is starting to like water down just because there's too many members. And this is the point when the NWO really started getting big. The WWF starts getting a little bit edgier, and Steve Austin is in his early inception. And McMahon is like, okay, I'm getting killed here. I am getting absolutely fucking obliterated here. I got to do something else. I've got to get away from these cartoonish characters, and I got to start just pushing the envelope. And I think at that point, maybe that's where Vince Russo might have come into the scene and say, holy fuck, Vince, I just watched this episode of Jerry Springer, bro. Let's do that. I think that's probably around the time that it probably started. By the time the end of '98 came around, they got out of going to children. It was adult content by the time '98 came around, which was the start of the Attitude Era. Now,
Yep.
I remember the Attitude Era, and it was fucking awesome. The Attitude Era was awesome. You had bikers, you had skinheads, you had racism, you had boobs, you had bum, you had a porn star, you had like all these fucking guys running around. But everything just seemed to mesh. DX came into the mix. Now, I don't know if it obviously wasn't all at once, but the adult content definitely helped the WWF to the point where kids weren't allowed to watch wrestling anymore because they were telling their teachers to suck it in school. Like it was, and especially Steve Austin. Like we thought it was, it was unheard of for a guy to walk around like, and he didn't really say a lot. He said damn, he said hell, and he said ass. But to say that on national television back then, that was a big fucking deal.
It really was. Um, you got a guy that's going to beat the piss out of his boss every single week. How many stunners has Vince taken on Monday Night Raw?
Oh, a lot. A lot.
And I mean, how many people out there would love to do that to their boss?
Mm-hmm. Kick the
Give them a
shit out
kick
of your
in the
boss
gut,
and then drink beer after.
drop a stunner on them, and fucking guzzle a beer. Like,
And it was this time that this is when the channel surfing started for us.
Yep.
Do you remember how pissed off Dad used to get? Oh, will you fucking leave it on one? No, I can't. Like, because we had no way to record it then. Like, there was a way
at the time,
but it was like, no, I can't stop. So that was episode 2. That was the end of episode 2. Now the final episode for this show, number 3, was called Embracing the Attitude. So like we just talked about it. So WWF started running with DX. Hart Foundation were pretty over too with the whole anti-America thing. Steve Austin was huge. And WCW, here it is a few years later, is still focused on the New World Order. There's no... The biggest storylines they're saving is all for the New World Order, which, and again, when we did our episodes on who killed WCW, someone should have stepped in, Brad Siegel, Dick, and say, Eric, you're kind of getting lost in this whole New World Order thing. You got to start focusing on other stuff, because WCW or WWF it was slowly but it was coming. They were catching WCW. And we talked about like their characters. They had pimps. They had Steve Austin, sex, boobs, bombs. Like it was edgy television directed at adults and teenagers. Where WCW like, okay, this was cool 2 years ago when the NWO came in, or a year and a half ago, but it's the same thing. You're not giving me anything new. It's the same old thing. It's a title match. They're going to come in. They're going to jump the guy. Hogan's going to keep the title. Where you didn't know what was going to happen now in WWE. So the momentum had switched. So we're into the Attitude Era, and I'll say it again. WCW, yet again, is still focusing on the New World Order. WCW wouldn't and was not allowed to go in the direction that the WWF was. And Eric Bischoff actually was told by higher ups that we have to keep it. NWO was fine. We think it could be a little, we think it's a little racy at times, but we have to keep it family orientated so the members of the whole family can watch it. Members of the family weren't sitting around watching Monday Night Raw. I guarantee you that, with bums and boobs and racism and Steve Austin flipping people off and just like the anti-establishment, right? You jumped on the Steve Austin bandwagon bigger than anybody. Like you would walk. I even saw you leaving like wherever you would go. If it was to play street hockey or if you were just going to the store for something, you even tried to walk like Steve Austin. Dad actually caught it one time. He said, "Look at that little fucker trying to walk like the bald guy on wrestling."
Stone Cold was my man. I mean, like I was always anti establishment, and for me to see him be able to go out and beat the piss out of his boss, like I was living vicariously through him, and that was me being able to do the same thing to Dad.
So Ted Turner, once the Attitude Era gets going, actually called Vince McMahon. Now they hadn't talked in years and years. Yep. And this is out of the mouth of Vince McMahon. Ted Turner calls Vince and would not admit that the WWF had a better product. He told Vince, the only reason you're beating me, Vince, is because you and the WWF are showing more of the tit. That's right out of Vince McMahon's mouth. Vince McMahon said, what? He just would not admit that the product was better. So, at this time, during the Attitude Era, here comes this little bingo hall organization called ECW, which changed wrestling again with their like the hardcore wrestling. They were kind of like renegades. And the WWF starts, next thing you know, after a few months, WCW gets the names. WWF's matches start getting a little bit more violent. And then next thing you know, they start doing hardcore matches, and they bring in Mick Foley to kind of quarterback those matches because he was sick and didn't give a shit what he jumped off of or what he did to himself anyway. WCW tried to do the same thing and it sucked. Do you remember WCW's hardcore matches with like the hardcore title and stuff? I want you to tell me your favorite hardcore match in WCW.
I honestly, I don't remember the hardcore series.
Exactly.
I don't.
It sucked. It was so bad. It was so fucking bad. So at this time, The Rock is starting to get huge.
He's in the Nation at this time, right?
I believe he was either in the Nation or he had just left the Nation. I can't remember. But it was it was shortly before, shortly after. It's in around there. So on top of all the talent that the WWF has, Rock is now getting huge. And this is the early part of WCW being in trouble. And what do to try to right the ship? They just keep focusing on the old New World Order. That's their go-to. They're not focusing on the roster. I think Eric Bischoff and Turner Broadcasting, they just got complacent. They had won in the ratings for so long, they just figured the ship would right itself and it would
Right.
just start coming back. But I'm going to go back and say it again. I think Bischoff got lost in being an on-screen character and hanging with the New World Order and hanging around with his good buddy Hulk Hogan and living the rock and roll lifestyle that he just fucking dropped the ball a little bit.
Yeah, I can see that. I can totally see that.
I mean, I would too. Don't get me wrong. I mean, it's easy. Fuck, it would be easy to get caught up in something like that when you're having fun. But I think he forgot he was a boss, I think was the biggest thing.
Yep. Yep.
So now, with everything WWF has, here comes Mr. McMahon. The character Mr. McMahon is created after the Montreal Screwjob. And he starts fighting with Steve Austin, and they were things of legend. The battles. And that went on for a long ass time, those battles. So eventually, April 13th, 1998, almost 2 years, Raw finally wins in the ratings war thanks to the Vince McMahon Stone Cold Steve Austin battles. Now, because the ratings are coming up, the sponsorships are coming up, attendance is up in the house shows and like for Raw and all that stuff. WWE is spending money. McMahon feels comfortable spending money now to try to make the product better. And at this point, at the same time, WCW is the ATM is they're starting to pull the plug a little bit because Turner's losing money. Well, he's hemorrhaging money. And we talked about that before, about money being allocated like for bottom lines in the Turner organization and all that stuff. But Turner, he's not in trouble. He's not in trouble, but it's getting there at this point. The love for WCW was fading, I think, and the Attitude Era was starting to decimate them because they wouldn't stop. Well, they were told they had to stay family orientated and they had to keep well, I don't know if they had to keep. They kept focusing on the New World Order. So you're starting to lose money. WWF is starting to overtake you in the ratings. Now, you're Eric Bischoff. We'll assume you got lost a little bit in the shuffle, forgot you're a boss, you're running with the New World Order. Okay, so we'll go back to that night in April. WWF finally, after almost 2 years, wins a ratings war one night. Do you think Bischoff cared because he had won for 83 straight weeks? Do you think this one night irked him at all? Or was he like, give them one, we'll make it up next week? If you're Eric Bischoff, what do you do to right this ship? If you're Eric Bischoff?
I think he likely looked at it like, it's 1 week. We're going to rebound from this. I mean, they won for what? 83 weeks? 82, 83?
83 straight weeks, yep.
83. If I'm Bischoff, I'm thinking, it's a one-off. And like, he's probably looking at this from the standpoint of, we've controlled things for this long. I think there was a little bit of overconfidence there.
A little?
But just a bit.
But he should have known that the writing was on the wall whenever Ted Turner is starting to pull on the purse chain a little bit and say, Eric, like.
Absolutely.
But again, and again, we've talked about that it wasn't WCW's fault for losing money whenever all that money was being allocated. But at the same time, Eric Bischoff didn't do much to try to right that ship. okay, it's one night. We won 83 weeks in a row, but it was obvious, I think, to everyone that as the weeks kept coming, I could be wrong, but that was the last night. WCW never won a ratings war after that from that time on when WWF won that night, and they never won again until they ran out of business. And that is it, guys. We covered the first 3 episodes of the Monday Night Wars. We're going to keep doing this until we go through every single one of them. We're going to try to get probably 3 to 4 episodes a show. And that's what we do. We're going to speed through it. And until next time, my name is Doug. I'm out, and we'll see you on the next one.